What happens when cruelty meets talent, when prejudice collides with grace? In an upscale Boston restaurant, two lives intersect in an unexpected moment of public humiliation. Marcus Thompson, a classically trained vocalist from Juilliard turned waiter, carries his silenced gift with quiet dignity. Victoria Palmer, a successful real estate developer haunted by her mother's musical legacy, wields her privilege like a weapon. When she demands Marcus sing for her entertainment during her birthday celebration, neither expects the profound transformation that follows. A single hymn, Amazing Grace, breaks through years of carefully constructed walls, revealing buried truths and shared pain. This story explores the power of music to heal, the weight of dreams deferred, and the unexpected ways redemption finds us. Through their journey, we discover how prejudice can silence extraordinary voices, how privilege can blind us to our own humanity, and how second chances sometimes come disguised as moments of crisis. As Marcus and Victoria navigate their way from that cruel encounter to an unlikely partnership, they learn that sometimes our greatest disappointments lead us to our true purpose. Dear viewer, if you are new to this channel and watching my video for the first time, my humble request you to subscribe this channel and press the bell icon not to miss my daily published news stories. Thanks you. The polished brass handles of the Golden Fork's heavy oak doors gleamed in the late afternoon sunlight, a daily reminder to Marcus Thompson that he was stepping into a world that wasn't quite his own. He adjusted his precisely knotted black tie and smoothed down his crisp white shirt, the ritual as familiar as breathing after 8 years of service at Boston's most prestigious restaurant. The kitchen's controlled chaos greeted him as he entered through the staff entrance, the symphony of clattering pots and sizzling pans a stark contrast to the measured elegance of the dining room beyond. Chef Antoine's accented voice rose above the din, barking orders in his characteristic mix of French and English that always brought a slight smile to Marcus's face. "Marcus, mon ami," Antoine called out, his round face breaking into a genuine smile. "Early as always, eh? Good thing too, the Henderson party cancelled, but we just got a reservation for the mayor's office. Table 12 will be yours tonight." "Got it, chef," Marcus responded, heading to his locker to store his worn leather messenger bag. Inside was the music book he'd been studying during his lunch breaks, old habit from his teaching days, one he couldn't quite shake even after all these years. At 36, Marcus carried himself with a dignity that seemed to flow from somewhere deep within. His movements were deliberate and graceful, earned through years of practice both in restaurant service and in pursuits he'd left behind. His dark eyes held a warmth that regular customers had come to appreciate, though few ever bothered to look close enough to notice. "You see the new girl training today?" Lisa, another veteran server, asked as she organized her station. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her lined face carrying the wisdom of 20 years in the service industry. "Poor thing's shaking like a leaf." Marcus glanced over at the young trainee, barely out of college, fumbling with the wine opener during orientation. "We were all new once," he said softly, remembering his own first days. "I'll keep an eye on her if she's in my section." The dining room was a study in old-world elegance. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over damask tablecloths, and dark wooden wainscoting lined walls adorned with original oil paintings. Marcus began his pre-service routine, checking each table in his section with meticulous care. Every fork aligned, every wine glass spotless, every detail perfect. Excellence was his armor. As he worked, his mind drifted to the morning's voice exercises, another old habit, practiced in the privacy of his small apartment. His grandmother's words echoed in his memory, "Baby, when God gives you a gift, you don't let it gather dust. You keep it polished, even if nobody else sees it shine." The first guests began arriving at 6, and Marcus slipped into the familiar rhythm of service. He moved between tables with practiced ease, his voice modulated to exactly the right tone, professional, courteous, but never servile. He'd learned long ago the delicate balance required in his position. "The sea bass is particularly excellent tonight," he recommended to an elderly couple at table 15. "Chef's preparation with the herb crust really brings out the natural flavors." The woman smiled genuinely at him, some customers did, while her husband barely glanced up from his menu. Marcus was used to being both visible and invisible, often in the same moment. He developed a sixth sense for reading people over the years, adjusting his approach accordingly. Between courses, he caught snatches of conversations from his colleagues in the service station. Lisa was talking about her son's college applications, while James, the youngest waiter besides the trainee, was excitedly discussing his band's upcoming gig at a local bar. "You should come hear us play, Marcus," James said, his enthusiasm infectious. "I remember you mentioning you were into music." Marcus smiled but shook his head. "Maybe another time," he replied, the same answer he always gave to such invitations. The truth, that he'd once taught music theory at a prestigious prep school, that he'd trained in classical voice at Juilliard before life took unexpected turns, stayed locked away where it belonged. The evening progressed smoothly until a commotion at table 20 caught everyone's attention. A customer was berating the new trainee over a wine selection, his voice carrying across the dining room. Marcus watched the girl's face flush with embarrassment, her hands trembling as she tried to handle the situation. Without hesitation, he moved to intervene. "Pardon me, sir," he said, his voice calm and assured. "I'd be happy to assist with selecting another wine more to your taste." His presence seemed to deflate the man's anger, and within moments, the situation was resolved. Later, in the kitchen, the trainee, Sarah, he'd learned, approached him with grateful eyes. "Thank you for earlier," she said. "I almost quit on the spot." Marcus paused in garnishing a plate of Dover sole. "The hardest part of this job isn't carrying plates or memorizing wine lists," he said quietly. "It's remembering who you are, no matter how others might see you. Don't let anyone take that from you." As the night wound down, Marcus found himself at the service bar, polishing glasses while soft jazz played from the dining room speakers. The melody caught his ear, an old standard his grandmother used to sing, and he hummed along almost unconsciously. "I didn't know you could sing," Sarah commented, stacking dessert menus nearby. Marcus fell silent, focusing on the glass in his hands. "Just an old hobby," he said after a moment. But his fingers tapped the counter in rhythm, muscle memory from years of piano training refusing to be completely suppressed. The last customers departed just after 11, leaving behind the comfortable quiet of closing time. As Marcus completed his side work, refilling salt cellars, rolling silverware for the next day, he allowed himself to feel satisfied with another successful shift. He'd managed the careful dance required of him, maintaining his dignity while ensuring every guest felt properly served. Chef Antoine emerged from the kitchen as the staff prepared to leave, his white coat showing the evidence of a busy service. "Good night, everyone," he called out. "Marcus, excellence as always, mon ami." Walking to his car in the employee lot, Marcus gazed up at the stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. His grandmother used to say that music was like those stars, even when you couldn't see them, they were there, shining. He touched the music book in his bag, allowing himself a moment of remembrance before driving home to his quiet apartment. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful balance, of measured words and calculated movements. But for now, in the privacy of his car, Marcus let himself sing softly, his rich baritone filling the space with an old spiritual his grandmother had taught him. The notes carried the weight of memory, of dreams deferred but not forgotten, of a talent that refused to dim despite years of hiding in plain sight. Victoria Palmer's Louboutin heels clicked against the marble floor of her corner office, the rhythm matching her rapid-fire instructions into her AirPods. At 29, she'd already made partner at Boston's most prestigious real estate development firm, a fact she mentioned at every opportunity. "No, absolutely not," she said, pacing before floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston harbor. "Tell them we need those permits by Friday, or we'll take our business elsewhere." She paused, running manicured fingers through her perfectly styled blonde hair. "I don't care if it's impossible. Make it happen." Ending the call, Victoria sank into her ergonomic chair and swiveled to face the harbor view. The morning sun scattered diamonds across the water, but she barely noticed the beauty. Her mind was already racing through her schedule, meetings, site visits, and dinner plans at the Golden Fork with her usual crowd. Her assistant, Margaret, appeared in the doorway with a steaming cup of coffee, oat milk latte, extra hot, exactly as Victoria insisted. "Your 9 o'clock is here," Margaret said, placing the cup on a coaster. "And your father called again." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together. "Tell him I'm in meetings all day," she said, not looking away from the window. And reschedule the 9 o'clock. I need to review the waterfront project proposals. Alone again, Victoria allowed herself a moment of stillness. Her office walls were decorated with awards and achievements, youngest partner in the firm's history, Boston Business Journal's 30 under 30, various real estate development accolades. Each one carefully chosen and positioned to tell the story she wanted others to see. Her phone buzzed with a text from Cassandra, her closest friend, or at least, the person who most closely resembled a friend in her carefully curated social circle. Don't forget, dinner tonight at Golden Fork. Trevor's bringing his new yacht broker friend. Total catch. Wear the red Versace. Victoria typed a quick confirmation, already mentally selecting accessories to match the suggested dress. These dinners had become a weekly ritual, a carousel of expensive wines, strategic networking, and carefully orchestrated social dynamics. She excelled at the game, just as she excelled at everything she set her mind to. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Victoria moved through her world with practiced precision, her confidence as much a part of her outfit as her designer clothes. Yet sometimes, in quiet moments between negotiations and networking, a different sensation crept in, a hollow feeling she quickly pushed aside. At lunch, she picked at a salad while reviewing property portfolios on her tablet. The office buzzed around her, but she remained in her own bubble of spreadsheets and projections. A notification popped up, another missed call from her father. She dismissed it without hesitation. Ms. Palmer. Margaret's voice interrupted her concentration. The contractors for the Southey project need your signature on these forms. Victoria glanced up, her expression shifting seamlessly into professional mode. Leave them here. I'll review them before I leave. She paused, then added, and have the car service ready at 7. I'm dining at the Golden Fork tonight. The afternoon sun was setting by the time Victoria left the office, casting long shadows across the city. In the back of the town car, she touched up her makeup with practiced efficiency. The red Versace dress hugged her curves perfectly, a power color for a power player. The Golden Fork stood like a beacon of old-world sophistication among the modern buildings of downtown Boston. Victoria had been coming here for years, long enough to be recognized by the maitre d', who greeted her with practiced deference. Good evening, Ms. Palmer. Your usual table is ready, and your guests have already arrived. She swept through the dining room, aware of the heads turning to watch her passage. The restaurant's atmosphere wrapped around her like a familiar embrace, the soft lighting, the murmur of cultured conversations, the gentle clink of fine china and crystal. Cassandra waved from their regular table, her diamond bracelet catching the light. Victoria, darling. You look amazing. Come meet James, he just got back from Monaco. The next hour dissolved into a carefully choreographed dance of subtle flirtation and business networking. Victoria played her part perfectly, laughing at the right moments, dropping just enough hints about her latest development projects to maintain interest without seeming boastful. Yet something felt off tonight. Maybe it was the third missed call from her father weighing on her mind, or maybe it was the way the yacht broker's stories reminded her of summers spent on her family's boat before everything changed. Before her mother. More wine, madam. The waiter's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She glanced up, meeting dark eyes that quickly looked away, trained in the proper etiquette of service. Something about his dignified bearing caught her attention for a moment before she dismissed it. Yes, she said, perhaps more sharply than necessary. And make sure it's properly chilled this time. Of course, madam. His voice was cultured, controlled, revealing nothing of what might lie beneath the professional exterior. As he moved away, Cassandra leaned in conspiratorially. God, can you believe they let him serve in the main dining room? I mean, I know we're supposed to be all progressive now, but really. Victoria felt something twist uncomfortably in her stomach, but she pushed it aside, forcing a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. Tell me more about that property in the South End, she said, steering the conversation back to safer waters. The waiter returned with the wine, his movements graceful and precise as he poured. For a brief moment, Victoria caught a reflection of herself in the dark glass of the bottle, perfectly coiffed, perfectly poised, perfectly empty. Later, As the evening wound down and the bills were settled with multiple platinum cards, Victoria found herself lingering at the table. Her companions had already departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the last sips of an expensive Bordeaux. The dining room had quieted, with only a few tables still occupied. Soft jazz played in the background, something old, something that tugged at a memory she couldn't quite grasp. It reminded her of Sunday mornings long ago, her mother playing the piano in their sun-filled living room. "Will there be anything else, madam?" The waiter had returned, his presence pulling her back to the present. Victoria straightened, armor sliding back into place. "No," she said curtly, gathering her clutch. "Just the check." Walking out into the cool night air, Victoria felt the familiar hollow sensation creeping back. Her phone buzzed again, her father, again. This time, she almost answered. Almost. Instead, she typed a quick message to her driver and stood waiting, the city lights reflecting off the restaurant's windows. Through the glass, she could see the waiter clearing her table, his movements containing a grace that seemed out of place in such mundane tasks. The car arrived, and Victoria slipped into the leather interior, her red dress a splash of color in the darkness. As they pulled away from the Golden Fork, she caught herself humming the jazz tune from earlier. Her mother had loved jazz, had filled their house with music before. Victoria cut off the thought abruptly. "Home," she instructed the driver, her voice sharp enough to discourage any attempt at conversation. She spent the ride reviewing emails on her phone, focusing on numbers and negotiations instead of memories and missed calls. In her penthouse apartment, Victoria kicked off her heels and poured herself a nightcap. The city spread out below her, a glittering carpet of lights and possibilities. She had everything she'd worked for: success, power, influence. So why did the silence feel so loud tonight? Her phone buzzed one final time. Her father's name appeared on the screen, along with a text, "Just wanted to remind you, it's 10 years tomorrow. I thought maybe we could visit her together." Victoria set the phone face down on the counter without responding. Tomorrow would be another day of meetings and deals, of perfectly maintained facades and careful calculations. She would not think about jazz music or Sunday mornings or the way her mother's piano had sat silent for months before they finally sold it. But as she prepared for bed, Victoria found herself humming that tune again, the melody haunting her like a ghost of something lost, something she didn't even know she was missing. The Golden Fork buzzed with unusual energy on a Wednesday evening in late September. Victoria Palmer's 29th birthday celebration had commandeered the restaurant's premier section, 3 tables combined to accommodate her carefully selected guests. Crystal glasses caught the light from overhead chandeliers, creating prisms that danced across expensive silk blouses and tailored suits. Marcus moved through the space with practiced ease, though tonight's service required extra attention. Victoria's party had already gone through 4 bottles of Dom Perignon, and the loud laughter coming from their corner suggested the night was just beginning. Another round for the birthday girl. Cassandra's voice carried across the dining room, drawing disapproving glances from other patrons. "And make it snappy." Marcus maintained his professional composure as he approached their table. Victoria sat at its center, resplendent in a gold sequin dress that caught every ray of light. Her cheeks were flushed from champagne, her usual calculated demeanor showing hairline cracks. "Certainly, madam," Marcus responded, moving to retrieve the champagne. As he turned, he heard snippets of conversation that made him pause imperceptibly. "God, Victoria, remember last year at Le Cirque?" One of the men was saying, his words slightly slurred. "When you made that waitress recite Shakespeare?" Victoria's laugh tinkled like broken glass. "She claimed to be an actress. I was just giving her a chance to prove it." Marcus returned with the champagne, his movements deliberate and precise as he began pouring. He'd served enough wealthy patrons to recognize the dangerous glint in Victoria's eye as she watched him, the look of someone who'd had too much to drink and was searching for entertainment. "You know what would make this birthday perfect?" Victoria's voice cut through the ambient noise. "Some entertainment." Marcus kept his face neutral, continuing to pour methodically around the table. He'd nearly finished when Victoria's manicured hand grabbed his wrist, forcing him to look at her. "You must know some songs," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Something spiritual perhaps. The table fell silent, the kind of silence that preceded storms. Marcus could feel every eye in the restaurant turning toward them, could sense Lisa tensing at her station nearby, ready to intervene. "I'm afraid I'm just a waiter, madam," he replied quietly, maintaining eye contact with dignity. "Perhaps I could have the pianist play something for your celebration?" Victoria's grip tightened slightly. "Oh, come now. Don't be modest. I bet you have a wonderful singing voice. All your people do, don't they?" The silence deepened. Someone at a nearby table gasped softly. Marcus could see Chef Antoine in the kitchen doorway, his face darkening with anger. "Ms. Palmer," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the thunder of his heart. "I'm here to serve your meal, not to provide entertainment." "But it's my birthday," Victoria pouted, playing to her audience. "And I'm one of this restaurant's best customers. Surely you want to make the customer happy." Her words carried a threat beneath their superficial playfulness. Marcus thought of his rent payment due next week, of the medical bills still piling up from his grandmother's final illness. He thought of the countless times he'd swallowed his pride in similar situations, choosing survival over dignity. But then he thought of his grandmother's words, "Baby, there are some things worth more than money. Your soul is one of them." Before he could respond, Victoria released his wrist and stood, swaying slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the entire restaurant, "our waiter here is going to favor us with a song. Let's all make him feel welcome." A few nervous titters arose from her table, but the rest of the restaurant remained deathly quiet. Marcus could see Lisa starting forward, could hear Chef Antoine's footsteps approaching, but he raised a hand slightly, stopping them both. In that moment, time seemed to slow. Marcus saw the years stretched behind him, the scholarships lost due to budget cuts, the teaching position that evaporated when the school board decided he wasn't the right fit for their prestigious academy, the countless small indignities that had led him here. He saw Victoria Palmer's smirking face, so certain of her power to humiliate him for her entertainment. But he also saw something else in her eyes, something beneath the cruel amusement and champagne haze. Something that looked almost like desperation. "Very well, Miss Palmer," he said quietly, every word measured and clear. "If you insist." The restaurant held its collective breath. Victoria's triumphant smile wavered slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to accept. She sank back into her chair, wine glass clutched like a shield. Marcus straightened his spine, adjusted his tie, and closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them again, he was no longer in the Golden Fork. He was in his grandmother's church, standing beside her as she taught him to let his voice soar above earthly concerns. He took a breath, and prepared to sing. The opening notes of "Amazing Grace" filled the Golden Fork, and time stood still. Marcus's voice, rich as aged bourbon and clear as mountain spring water, transformed the restaurant's atmosphere instantly. The first word alone silenced every conversation, stilled every fork, and drew every eye to the tall figure standing beside Victoria Palmer's table. Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, guiding him through the familiar melody. She had taught him this hymn when he was just 5 years old, standing in her small kitchen while cornbread baked in the oven. "This song," she told him, "is about more than religion, baby. It's about transformation. That saved a wretch like me." Victoria's smirk had frozen on her face, replaced by something else entirely. Her eyes widened as Marcus's baritone filled every corner of the restaurant, his classical training evident in every perfectly controlled note. This was no amateur church singer, this was artistry of the highest caliber. "I once was lost, but now am found." Marcus kept his eyes focused on a point just above the heads of his audience, but he could feel their reactions. The couple at table 7 had stopped eating entirely, their food forgotten. The businessman who had been arguing on his phone now held it limply at his side, his mouth slightly open. And Victoria. Victoria had gone completely still, her face drained of color. "Was blind, but now I see." As he moved into the second verse, Marcus allowed his voice to soar higher, demonstrating the full range of his classical training. Years of technical practice at Juilliard flowed through every note, every subtle modulation. He had performed this hymn in churches, in concert halls, and once, before everything changed, at Carnegie Hall. The restaurant's usual sounds had ceased entirely. Even the kitchen staff had emerged to listen, Chef Antoine standing in the doorway with tears tracking unashamedly down his cheeks. Lisa clutched her serving tray to her chest, her face a mixture of pride and fierce joy. Through many dangers, toils, and snares. Marcus thought of his own dangers and snares, the scholarship committee that had apologetically withdrawn their support, the opera company that had suddenly decided his role would go to someone else, the endless stream of, not quite right for our audience, rejections. Yet here he was, singing anyway. I have already come. Victoria Palmer's hands had begun to tremble. The wine glass she clutched threatened to spill, but she seemed unaware of it. Her eyes were fixed on Marcus's face with an expression of shock and something deeper, recognition, perhaps, or remembrance. "'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far." His grandmother's last days had been filled with music. Even when the pain was at its worst, she had insisted he sing to her. "God gave you that voice for a reason," she'd said. "Don't let anyone make you hide it. And grace will lead me home." As Marcus approached the final verse, he finally allowed himself to look directly at Victoria. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, or at least the beginning of one. He saw tears tracking down her cheeks, though she seemed unaware of them. The final notes hung in the air like crystal, pure and perfect. For several seconds after Marcus finished, complete silence reigned. Then, from somewhere in the back of the restaurant, applause began. It spread quickly, building to a thunderous ovation that shook the wine glasses on the tables. Diners rose to their feet, their appreciation overwhelming any concern for proper restaurant etiquette. An elderly woman at a corner table was openly weeping. The restaurant's owner, who had emerged from his office at the commotion, stood gaping in amazement. But Marcus barely registered the applause. His attention remained fixed on Victoria Palmer, who had not moved or clapped. She sat frozen in her chair, tears still falling, her carefully constructed facade completely shattered. In her eyes, he saw something that surprised him, not shame or anger, but a profound sadness. "My mother," she whispered, so softly that only Marcus could hear, "she used to sing that in church." Before Marcus could respond, Victoria stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Without a word to her guests, she grabbed her purse and fled the restaurant, leaving behind a stunned silence in her wake. The applause gradually died down, replaced by excited murmuring. Marcus could hear snippets of conversation, "Must be professionally trained. Never heard anything like it. Why is he working here?" Chef Antoine approached, clapping Marcus on the shoulder with uncharacteristic emotion. "Mon ami," he said softly, "you have been hiding more than just your voice, I think." Marcus straightened his tie, his professional demeanor sliding back into place despite the trembling in his hands. "If you'll excuse me," he said quietly, "I have other tables to attend to." But as he moved through the restaurant, continuing his duties as if nothing extraordinary had happened, Marcus knew that everything had changed. The carefully constructed walls he built around his past, around his talent, had crumbled with just one song. In the kitchen, he paused for a moment, bracing himself against the prep counter. His grandmother's words came back to him, "Sometimes, baby, God makes us sing not for ourselves, but for someone else who needs to hear the music." Outside in the dining room, he could hear Victoria's abandoned guests discussing her sudden departure in confused whispers. Something told him this wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning. Marcus picked up his serving tray and straightened his shoulders. There were still tables to serve, orders to take, wines to pour. But as he pushed through the kitchen doors, he felt lighter somehow, as if by finally letting his voice soar, he had set something free in himself as well. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of appreciative glances and whispered conversations. But Marcus kept thinking about the look in Victoria Palmer's eyes just before she fled, that moment of recognition, of shared understanding. He thought about transformation, about amazing grace, and about how sometimes the most profound changes begin with a single song. Victoria's Mercedes idled at a red light, but she barely noticed. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white, tears still streaming down her face. Amazing Grace echoed in her mind, each note unlocking memories she'd kept locked away for a decade. Her mother, Elizabeth Palmer, sitting at their baby grand piano on Sunday mornings. The smell of coffee and fresh-baked scones wafting from the kitchen while hymns filled their home. Music speaks what cannot be expressed, she used to say, her fingers dancing across the keys. The light turned green, but Victoria didn't move until angry honking jolted her back to reality. She pulled over into an empty parking lot, her whole body shaking. That voice, the waiter's voice, had somehow reached through 10 years of carefully constructed walls and touched something she thought she buried with her mother. "Damn him," she whispered, but there was no real anger in her words. Instead, she felt stripped bare, exposed in a way that terrified her. The cruel game she tried to play had backfired spectacularly, revealing not his shame but her own. Her phone buzzed insistently, probably Cassandra or one of her other guests wondering about her abrupt departure. She ignored it, instead pulling up a photo she kept hidden in a folder marked Old Files. Her mother smiled back at her, seated at the piano, caught mid-laugh during what would be their last Christmas together. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus sat at his small upright piano for the first time in months. His fingers found the keys hesitantly, picking out the melody he'd sung earlier. The instrument was out of tune, but he barely noticed as memories of his grandmother flooded back. "Music ain't just about the notes, baby," she'd tell him during their lessons. "It's about the spirit behind them." He'd been 12 when she first noticed his gift, heard him singing along to the radio with perfect pitch. She'd worked extra shifts as a nurse to pay for his first proper voice lessons. His phone lit up with a text from Lisa, "You okay?" That was something else tonight. He typed back a quick, "I'm fine," before setting the phone aside. But was he? For years he'd kept his talent hidden, protecting himself from the pain of doors closed because of his skin color. Tonight, he'd let that wall down, and he wasn't sure how to feel about it. The next morning, Victoria arrived at her office earlier than usual, makeup carefully applied to hide her sleepless night. She'd barely sat down when Margaret appeared with her usual coffee. "There's something else," Margaret said hesitantly. "Someone dropped this off for you." She handed Victoria a worn leather folder. Inside was a yellowed program from Carnegie Hall, dated 15 years ago. A much younger Marcus Thompson was listed among the featured performers, described as a rising star in the world of classical voice. Victoria's hands trembled as she read his biography. Juilliard Scholarship. Competition winner. Glowing reviews from classical music critics. Until suddenly, nothing, as if he'd vanished from the musical world completely. She opened her laptop and began searching. Article after article praised his early career, predicted his bright future. Then, abruptly, the mentions stopped. One small piece in a local paper caught her eye, promising career cut short, racial controversy at Metropolitan Opera. The article was vague about details, but reading between the lines, Victoria felt sick. The same barriers her mother had fought against in her own classical career, the same prejudices that had driven Elizabeth Palmer to teach music in inner-city schools instead of performing. Back at the Golden Fork, Marcus arrived for his shift to find Chef Antoine waiting for him. "The owner wants to see you," Antoine said, his expression unreadable. Marcus followed him to the office, his heart pounding. He'd known there might be consequences for last night, had prepared himself for the possibility of losing his job. Instead, he found Mr. Davidson, the owner, beaming at him. "My wife was here last night," he said without preamble. "She hasn't stopped talking about your voice. Why didn't you tell us you were trained at Juilliard?" "It didn't seem relevant to serving tables, sir." Davidson shook his head. "Well, it's relevant now. How would you feel about performing regularly? We could feature you on our jazz nights, make it a special attraction." Marcus felt the old familiar tightness in his chest. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I'm comfortable with my current position." "Think about it," Davidson insisted. "This could be an opportunity." But Marcus had heard those words before, had learned the hard way how quickly opportunities could vanish when people's true colors showed through. As he left the office, he found Lisa waiting. There's something else, she said. That woman from last night, Ms. Palmer. She's been calling all morning, asking what time your shift starts. Victoria sat at table 12, her usual confident demeanor notably absent. She'd changed her regular evening reservation to lunch, ensuring she would be there when Marcus began his shift. The folder from Carnegie Hall lay on the table beside her untouched water glass. When Marcus emerged from the kitchen and saw her, he paused almost imperceptibly before approaching her table. His professional mask was firmly in place, but there was a wariness in his eyes that made Victoria's chest tight with shame. "Ms. Palmer," he said formally. "Would you like to see the lunch menu?" "Please sit," she said softly, gesturing to the chair across from her. When he hesitated, she added, "Please. I owe you an apology, and I'd rather not do it with you standing over me." After a moment's consideration, Marcus sat, his posture straight and guarded. Victoria took a deep breath, forcing herself to meet his eyes. "What I did last night was cruel and inexcusable," she began. "I wanted to apologize, not just for my behavior, but for everything it represented. I'm deeply ashamed." Marcus's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes softened slightly. "Apology accepted, Ms. Palmer." "Victoria," she corrected. "And, that's not all I wanted to say." She touched the folder on the table. "I did some research this morning." "Ah," Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. "I see. My mother was a classical pianist," Victoria continued, the words tumbling out now. "She faced similar obstacles in her career. It's why she gave up performing to teach instead." She paused, fighting back tears. "That song you sang last night, it was her favorite. She used to play it every Sunday morning." Something in Marcus's face changed, a recognition of shared understanding. "Used to. She died 10 years ago. Cancer." Victoria's fingers traced the edge of the folder. "I stopped listening to music after that. Couldn't bear it. But last night, when you sang..." She trailed off, unable to find the words. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "My grandmother taught me that song," he finally said. "She worked extra shifts to pay for my voice lessons. Believed in me more than I believed in myself sometimes." "Is she?" "She passed last year. I still have medical bills from her final illness." Victoria nodded, understanding flowing between them. They sat in silence for a moment, both lost in memories of the women who had shaped their lives through music. "I read about what happened at the Metropolitan Opera," Victoria said gently. "It wasn't right." Marcus's jaw tightened. "A lot of things aren't right, Ms. Victoria. We learn to live with them. But should we?" She leaned forward, sudden intensity in her voice. "My mother used to say that music was a universal language, that it could bridge any divide. Last night, when you sang, I felt her presence for the first time in years." "Music has power," Marcus agreed softly. "But so do other things. Money. Prejudice. Fear." "I know," Victoria said. "I've been part of that problem. Last night made me see that very clearly." She took another deep breath. "I have connections in the music world, my mother's old contacts. I could dash." "No," Marcus cut her off firmly. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not interested in charity." "It wouldn't be charity," Victoria protested. "It would be rectifying a wrong. Your talent dash." "My talent is my own," Marcus said, standing. "What I choose to do with it is also my own choice." His voice was gentle but firm. "I appreciate your apology, Victoria. But I need to get back to work." As he turned to leave, Victoria called after him. Would you tell me about her? Your grandmother?" Marcus paused, looking back. Something in Victoria's expression, a mixture of hope and genuine remorse, made him reconsider. He glanced at his watch, then sat back down. "I have 10 minutes before my shift officially starts," he said. She was an extraordinary woman. For the next 10 minutes, they shared stories of the women who had filled their lives with music. Victoria told him about Sunday mornings at the piano, about her mother's dedication to teaching underprivileged students. Marcus spoke of his grandmother's determination, her faith in his talent, her belief that music could open doors that prejudice had closed. When Marcus finally stood to begin his shift, something had shifted between them. The waiter and the wealthy patron were gone, replaced by two people who had glimpsed something genuine in each other. "Same time tomorrow?" Victoria asked hesitantly. "I'd like to hear more about your time at Juilliard." Marcus considered for a moment, then nodded. "Same time tomorrow." As he walked away, Victoria remained at the table, looking down at the Carnegie Hall program. She thought about her mother's words, "Music speaks what cannot be expressed." Perhaps it could also heal what had been broken. She pulled out her phone and, for the first time in 10 years, dialed her father's number. When he answered, his surprise was evident. "Dad," she said softly, "tell me more about Mom's teaching program. The one for underprivileged music students. Is it still running?" Outside the restaurant window, the autumn sun painted the streets of Boston in warm gold. Inside, Marcus moved between tables with his usual grace, but there was a lightness in his step that hadn't been there before. Sometimes, he realized, transformation came not in grand gestures but in small moments of understanding. The piano in the corner of the restaurant caught his eye, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder about possibilities. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory, "Baby, when the right door opens, you'll know it. Just make sure your heart is ready to walk through it." The late afternoon sun streamed through the Golden Forks windows, catching dust motes in its golden light. Victoria and Marcus had fallen into a routine over the past week, meeting during the quiet hour before his shift began. Today, Marcus had brought something different to their table, a worn leather photo album. "My grandmother kept everything," he said, carefully opening the album. "Every program, every review, every photograph." Victoria leaned forward, studying a yellowed newspaper clipping. A teenage Marcus stood on stage, accepting a trophy at a state choir competition. His smile was unguarded then, full of hope and confidence. "Tell me about Juilliard," she said softly. "What was it like?" Marcus's fingers traced the edge of a photograph showing him in front of the famous building. "It was everything I dreamed of. And everything I feared." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I was one of only 3 black students in the vocal program that year. The pressure to prove yourself worthy, it never lets up." "But you succeeded," Victoria pointed out, gesturing to a glowing review from his graduate recital. "I did." Marcus's voice held a mixture of pride and pain. "Full scholarship, top of my class, multiple competition wins. Everything was falling into place. Then came the Metropolitan Opera opportunity." Victoria sat very still, sensing they were approaching the heart of the story. She'd read the vague news articles, but she knew there was more beneath the surface. "They needed a replacement tenor for their production of Don Giovanni," Marcus continued, his voice taking on a distant quality. "The artistic director had heard me perform at a showcase. He said I was perfect for the role." A bitter smile crossed his face. What he didn't say was that some of the board members and major donors had concerns. "About your race," Victoria said quietly. Marcus nodded. "They never said it directly, of course. It was always wrapped in polite phrases. Audience expectations. Traditional casting. Box office considerations. But the message was clear." He turned a page in the album, revealing a series of photographs from various opera productions during his student years. "I'd faced it before, but this was different. This was supposed to be my big break. Instead, I learned that talent isn't always enough. That some doors remain closed no matter how well you sing." Marcus closed the album gently. The artistic director was apologetic. Said his hands were tied. Offered to help me find other opportunities. Victoria felt anger rising in her chest. "But you didn't look for other opportunities." "I tried, at first. But after the Met, word gets around in classical music circles. Suddenly, other companies that had been interested weren't returning calls. Audition slots were mysteriously filled. Competition entries were lost in the mail. He sat back, his eyes distant. My grandmother was sick by then. The medical bills were piling up. So I made a choice. Took this job, focused on taking care of her. She never forgave herself, you know. Kept saying if she hadn't gotten sick, I could have kept trying. But it wasn't her fault, Victoria protested. No, Marcus agreed softly. It wasn't. But she'd sacrificed so much for my dream. Watching it slip away broke her heart as much as it broke mine. Victoria reached across the table, hesitating before placing her hand over his. And you haven't sung professionally since? Last week was the first time I'd sung in public since my grandmother's funeral, he admitted. She made me promise to sing Amazing Grace. Said it was our song. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelation settling between them. Finally, Victoria spoke. My mother faced similar barriers, she said. Not because of race, but because she refused to play the game. Refused to compromise her principles about music education being for everyone, not just the elite. She pulled out her phone, showing Marcus a photograph of a smiling woman seated at a piano, surrounded by children of various ages and backgrounds. This was her program, Victoria explained. She took her concert earnings and poured them into providing music education in underserved communities. The board members at the symphony hated it. Said she was devaluing classical music by making it too accessible. Marcus studied the photograph, noting the joy on the children's faces. What happened to the program? Victoria's face fell. After she died. I let it fade away. I was angry, hurt. Threw myself into real estate development, into making money, into proving something to people who never really mattered. She laughed bitterly. Became exactly the kind of person my mother spent her life fighting against. Until last week, Marcus said quietly. Until last week, she agreed. When you sang, it was like hearing her voice again. Remembering who I used to be, who I was supposed to be. The restaurant was beginning to fill with early dinner guests. Marcus glanced at his watch, knowing he needed to start his shift soon. Thank you, Victoria said suddenly. For sharing this with me. For helping me remember. Marcus carefully put the photo album away. Sometimes we need reminding of who we are, he said. Your mother understood that. So did my grandmother. As he stood to begin his shift, Victoria called after him. Marcus? Would you be willing to see something tomorrow? Before your shift? He tilted his head questioningly. My mother's old studio, she said. It's been closed since she died, but I think it's time to open those doors again. The building looked smaller than Victoria remembered. 10 years of neglect had left their mark on the once vibrant music studio, but the bones were still good. She fumbled with the keys as Marcus stood beside her, both of them squinting in the morning sunshine. The door creaked open, releasing a wave of dusty air. Victoria stepped inside, her heels clicking on the hardwood floors. Sheet music still lay scattered about, frozen in time like the aftermath of some long-ago lesson. Mom always said a music studio should look lived in, Victoria said, running a finger through the dust on a baby grand piano. Said too much tidiness stifled creativity. Marcus moved through the space slowly, taking in the rows of chairs arranged for group lessons, the wall of photographs showing students at recitals, the shelves lined with music books and score sheets. Your mother taught here, he asked, studying a faded photo of Elizabeth Palmer surrounded by smiling students. This was her sanctuary, Victoria replied. She called it Grace Notes, a place where any child with a love of music could learn, regardless of their ability to pay. She paused, emotion thick in her voice. The day she was diagnosed, she was planning a student showcase. Marcus lifted the piano lid carefully, pressing a key. The note rang out, surprisingly in tune despite years of disuse. She kept it maintained. The tuner still comes twice a year, Victoria admitted. I never canceled a service. Couldn't bring myself to. She walked to a filing cabinet, pulled open a drawer. Inside, manila folders held student records, lesson plans, sheet music. She kept everything organized, even though she pretended to embrace chaos. Each folder represents a life she touched, a student she believed in. Marcus picked up a framed newspaper article from the wall. The headline read, "Local studio brings classical music to all." Elizabeth Palmer's quoted words jumped out at him, "Music isn't a privilege for the wealthy. It's a birthright for everyone." "She would have loved your voice," Victoria said quietly. "Would have fought those Met board members tooth and nail." Marcus replaced the article carefully. "What are you planning, Victoria?" She turned to face him, determination replacing the nostalgia in her expression. "I want to reopen the studio. Continue my mother's work. But I need help." She took a deep breath. "I need someone who understands both the music and the barriers some students face. Someone who can teach, inspire, and lead." "Victoria. Before you say no," she pressed on, "this isn't charity. It's not even about you, really. It's about all the other talented kids out there facing the same barriers you faced. The ones who need someone to believe in them, to fight for them." She moved to the piano, lifted a photograph of her mother teaching a young student. "Mom used to say that sometimes our greatest disappointments lead us to our true purpose. Maybe this is where your voice was meant to be all along." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, looking around the studio. He could almost see it as it must have been, filled with music, with hope, with possibility. "I have a job," he said finally. "Bills to pay." "The studio has an endowment," Victoria replied. "Mom made sure of that. It's been sitting untouched all these years. The salary would be more than you make at the restaurant, and you'd have full creative control of the program." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "I'm not asking for an answer right now. Just, think about it. Come back, play the piano, get a feel for the space. The keys are yours if you want them." Marcus ran his hand along the piano's smooth surface. "Why me?" "Because you understand what it means to have a gift and face obstacles. Because you never let those obstacles destroy your spirit." Victoria smiled slightly. "And because when you sang Amazing Grace that night, you reminded me of everything my mother believed in." The morning sun had risen higher, streaming through the dusty windows and illuminating the space in golden light. Marcus sat at the piano, his fingers finding the keys naturally. Soft notes filled the air, the beginning of a piece Victoria recognized from her childhood. Debussy's Clair de Lune. "Mom used to play this when she was thinking," she said softly. Marcus continued playing, the melody growing stronger, more confident. As the music filled the studio, Victoria could almost imagine the dust motes dancing in the sunlight were the ghosts of past students, past dreams, coming back to life. When the final notes faded away, Marcus sat quietly for a moment, his hands resting on the keys. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Victoria nodded, understanding this was all she could ask for now. She placed the studio keys on the piano. "Take your time," she said. "The studio has waited 10 years. It can wait a little longer for the right person." As they left, locking the door behind them, neither spoke. But something had shifted, like the first notes of a new composition beginning to take shape. In the car, Victoria glanced at Marcus. "Will you be at work tonight?" "Yes," he replied. "Someone has to make sure you get the properly chilled wine." They shared a smile, remembering how far they'd come from that first cruel encounter. Sometimes, Victoria reflected, second chances came in unexpected forms. As she drove him back to his apartment, Victoria's mind was already racing with possibilities. The studio could be cleaned, painted, renewed. Her mother's program could live again, touching new lives, opening new doors. But first, she knew, Marcus needed to find his own way forward. Some songs couldn't be rushed, they needed time to find their proper rhythm. The renovation of Grace Note's studio had taken 6 weeks. Victoria stood in the freshly painted reception area, surveying the transformation. New instruments lined the walls, the hardwood floors gleamed, and afternoon sunlight streamed through spotless windows. Yet Marcus still hadn't given her an answer. He'd been coming to the studio regularly, usually in the quiet hours before his shifts at the Golden Fork. Sometimes she'd arrive to find him at the piano, working through classical pieces she remembered from her childhood. Other times, she'd discover new lesson plans carefully written out on the teacher's desk, plans he claimed were just ideas. Tonight was different, though. Tonight was the studio's grand reopening gala, and Victoria had arranged something special without telling Marcus. "Everything's ready," her father said, appearing beside her. Their reconciliation over the past weeks had been tentative but genuine, built on shared memories of Elizabeth and hopes for the studio's future. "The guests are arriving." Victoria nodded, smoothing her simple black dress. No designer labels tonight. This wasn't about showing off wealth. This was about music, about legacy, about redemption. The studio filled quickly with an eclectic mix of guests, former students of Elizabeth Palmer, local music teachers, arts patrons, and even some of Victoria's real estate colleagues who'd been surprised by her sudden change in priorities. Chef Antoine had catered the event, and several of the Golden Fork staff had come to show support. Marcus arrived in a well-fitted charcoal suit, still wearing his restaurant name tag. He'd only agreed to attend after his shift, not knowing he was about to become the evening's focus. "Victoria," he said, taking in the crowd. "What's all this?" Before she could answer, a distinguished-looking man approached them. "Mr. Thompson. I'm Daniel Roberts, director of the Boston Conservatory's Community Outreach Program. I've heard a lot about you." Marcus shot Victoria a questioning look, but she merely smiled and stepped away, letting them talk. Throughout the evening, she'd arranged for Marcus to accidentally meet key figures in Boston's music education community, people who could help make Grace Note's studio a force for change. The crucial moment came when Victoria's father took the small stage they'd set up in the main teaching room. "Good evening, everyone. 10 years ago, my late wife Elizabeth had a dream, that music could break down barriers and change lives. Tonight, thanks to my daughter Victoria, that dream is being reborn." Victoria joined him at the microphone. "Mom believed that talent doesn't discriminate, and neither should we. Grace Note Studio will continue her mission, providing music education to any student with the desire to learn, regardless of their background or ability to pay." She paused, gathering courage for what came next. "But every dream needs a guiding voice. Someone who understands both the power of music and the obstacles many students face. Someone who never lost their love of teaching, even when the world tried to silence their own song." Marcus stood frozen in the audience, realization dawning on his face. "Many of you don't know that 10 years ago, another dream was deferred. A brilliant voice was silenced not by choice, but by prejudice and closed doors." Victoria's voice grew stronger. "Tonight, that changes. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to hear the voice I believe was meant to lead Grace Note Studio into its new chapter. Marcus Thompson." The spotlight found Marcus in the crowd. For a moment, he didn't move. Victoria held her breath, wondering if she'd overstepped. Then, slowly, he made his way to the stage. Standing before the microphone, Marcus surveyed the room. Victoria could see him wrestling with the moment, with all it represented. Then he began to speak. 10 years ago, I lost my voice. Not physically, but in every other way that mattered. I let disappointment and discrimination convince me that silence was safer than song." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "But my grandmother used to say that God doesn't give us gifts to hide them. He gives them to share, to teach, to heal." Marcus turned to Victoria. "A few weeks ago, a cruel moment became an unexpected blessing. It reminded me that music isn't just about performance, it's about connection, about transformation, about grace." He moved to the piano, sat down with natural elegance. "This piece was the first thing I ever taught a student. It seemed fitting to let it be the first thing I teach here." His fingers found the keys, and the opening notes of Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata filled the room. But then he did something unexpected. He began to sing, his rich baritone weaving a wordless melody above the piano line, transforming the familiar piece into something entirely new. The audience stood transfixed as Marcus's voice soared, carrying with it years of training, of loss, of hope reborn. Victoria felt tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling. In Marcus's voice, she heard her mother's dream living again. When the final notes faded, the silence lasted only a moment before the room erupted in applause. Marcus stood, bowing slightly, his eyes finding Victoria's in the crowd. In that look was his answer, not just to the job offer, but to the challenge of believing in dreams again. The rest of the evening became a celebration not just of the studio's reopening, but of possibility itself. Victoria watched as Marcus moved through the crowd, discussing ideas for programs and outreach with genuine excitement. His restaurant name tag still gleamed on his lapel, a reminder of where the journey had begun. 1 year later, Grace Note's studio hummed with life. The sound of scales, arpeggios, and occasional laughter drifted from practice rooms. Photographs of new students joined the old ones on the walls, creating a visual timeline of the studio's legacy. Marcus sat at his desk, Elizabeth Palmer's old desk, reviewing applications for the studio's scholarship program. The pile had grown substantially since word had spread about Grace Note's mission and success. "Mr. Thompson." A timid voice drew his attention. Jasmine, a 12-year-old student from Dorchester, stood in the doorway clutching her violin case. "I was wondering, could I practice here during lunch? The other kids make fun of me when I practice at school." Marcus smiled, remembering his own school days. "Come in, Jasmine. Actually, I think it's time you met someone." He led her to where a framed photograph hung, his grandmother in her church choir robe. "This is the woman who taught me that other people's judgment doesn't define your talent. How about we work on your piece together?" As they played, Victoria arrived for her weekly visit. She paused in the doorway, watching Marcus guide Jasmine through a difficult passage. His patience, his ability to build confidence while maintaining high standards, these were gifts as valuable as his voice. The studio had exceeded all expectations. Students from every background filled the classes, some paying full tuition, others on scholarships, but all held to the same standard of dedication. Marcus had assembled a diverse faculty, creating an environment where every student could see themselves represented in their teachers. Later, after Jasmine left for her next class, Victoria and Marcus sat in his office drinking coffee from the Golden Fork. Chef Antoine insisted on keeping them supplied. "The board approved the expansion," Victoria announced. "We can start looking at properties for the second location whenever you're ready." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. The studio's success had drawn attention from arts organizations across the city. Rather than compete, they'd chosen to collaborate, creating a network of opportunity for talented students who might otherwise have been overlooked. "Your mother would be proud," Marcus said softly. "Not just of the studio, but of you." Victoria touched the locket she always wore now. Inside was a photo of Elizabeth at the piano. "She would be proud of both of us. We're continuing her fight, just in a different way." Their conversation was interrupted by sounds from the main room, students arriving for the afternoon chamber music program. Among them was Trevor McKinley's son, the same Trevor who'd been at that fateful birthday dinner a year ago. His initial skepticism about sending his child to Grace Notes had turned to enthusiastic support when his son's musical ability flourished under Marcus's guidance. "We're changing minds," Victoria observed. "One student, one parent at a time." Marcus stood, straightening his tie, no longer a waiter's uniform, but the mark of a respected teacher. "That's how real change happens. Not through grand gestures, but through daily choices to see each other's humanity." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, catching the gold letters on the wall, Grace Notes Studio, where music knows no barriers. Below it hung two photographs side by side, Elizabeth Palmer and Marcus's grandmother, the women whose dreams had shaped this place. Students filled the halls now, creating the joyful chaos that Elizabeth had always loved. Victoria watched as Marcus moved among them, greeting each by name, offering encouragement here, gentle correction there. His voice, once silenced by prejudice, now filled the studio with purpose and hope. "Time for the advanced vocal class," he said, checking his watch. "Want to stay and listen?" Victoria smiled, settling into a chair near the piano. As Marcus began the lesson, his rich baritone guiding young voices through their exercises, she felt her mother's presence strongly. The studio had come full circle, healing old wounds and creating new possibilities. Later that evening, as they locked up, a sound made them pause. From one of the practice rooms came a clear voice singing, "Amazing Grace, Jasmine," working on the piece for the upcoming student showcase. Marcus and Victoria shared a knowing look. The song that had brought them here, that had sparked this transformation, lived on in a new generation. The cruel game at a restaurant had become a catalyst for change, proving that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes. "See you tomorrow?" Victoria asked, knowing the answer. Marcus nodded, his keys jingling as he pocketed them. Tomorrow, and all the tomorrows after that. There's work to be done. As they walked out into the evening, the studio's lights dimming behind them, the last notes of Jasmine's practice session followed them. Amazing Grace, indeed. The golden fork reminds us that beneath our social masks and predetermined roles, we all carry stories of loss, hope, and potential. Marcus and Victoria's journey from antagonists to allies illustrates how confronting our prejudices and privilege can lead to powerful transformation. Their story challenges us to question the barriers we create and maintain in our society, whether in the arts, education, or our daily interactions. The rebirth of Grace Note Studio represents more than just a happy ending, it's a call to action for all of us. How many talented voices remain silenced in our communities due to prejudice, lack of opportunity, or systemic barriers? How many dreams are deferred because we fail to see the humanity in others? This story asks us to consider our own role in either maintaining or breaking down these barriers. Like Victoria, we might need to confront our privileges and biases. Like Marcus, we might need to find the courage to reclaim our silenced gifts. And like both of them, we must recognize that true change happens one interaction, one decision, one moment of grace at a time. If this story moved you, don't let its message end here. Share it with others who might need to hear it. Consider supporting music education programs in underserved communities. Look for ways to use your own privilege or platform to amplify silenced voices. Most importantly, remember that transformation often begins in unexpected moments, even in something as simple as a song. Please like this video to help spread this important message, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, inspire, and remind us of our shared humanity. Together, we can work toward a world where talent knows no barriers, where grace transforms cruelty, and where every voice has the chance to be heard. What role will you play in this ongoing story of transformation?